times when I've done this, and I'll just set the stage about what I'm going to do very briefly, is that we look at history in a timeline sequence, and we kind of highlight, you know, what happens on certain dates at certain times, and that's what we're going to do tonight. But I think what we lose is what happens between dates sometime that connect the dots, the things that make certain stars align, that what happens in 1946, how did that happen, and why are you telling me that tonight? And oh yeah, now that ties in maybe 30 or 40 years later. So a little bit more than just doing the timeline, I'm going to try and touch on some of those types of things. And the part that I learned is I look back through this wonderful history of Westminster that takes us from, I think, early 1700s up until 1893. There's a nice section in here, the bakery. Now the bakery was founded in 1828, right down here on Main Street. If you look at the red building, the house to the left, the piece that was the bakery is no longer there, but it was a very small room where they first started, where Alfred Wyman first started this business. And in my memory, all I knew was Alfred Wyman started it, and then your great-great-grandfather bought it in 1892 or 3. But in reading this, what's interesting is successors have been Harrison G. Whitney, then Joseph W. Forbush, then Harrison G. Whitney again, Charles T. Damon. Damon took on a partner, obviously, Burnham, Daniel C. Miles, back to Damon and Berman a second time. Edward L. Berman became E. L. Berman and Sons, George N. Hayes, and who recently sold to J. Boardman. And the best I can figure from the history is J. Boardman was the owner at the time that my great-great-grandfather, Charles C. Dolly, purchased it. Dates are a little cloudy, but we're thinking around 1893. So, the thing that you want to understand is that we always thought of it as the cracker bakery, but in reading the history, number one, crackers as we know them today, a leavened cracker didn't really start until around the 1850s. It was basically hardtack, you know, and in the history it says flour and water that has been baked to the point, almost to the point of being unrecognizable, and will last forever. So I'm sure they baked hardtack, I'm sure they baked some bread, but they baked it for a very local, small-knit community. And that's the way things were back there. Transportation didn't exist. I don't know when the horse and wagon, that iconic piece of the logo, I don't know when that came into being. But my guess is that maybe that didn't come into being until maybe the 1840s, when the business kind of expanded into the new building that we see today. But for those first few years, I'm sure it was a very rudimentary business that just serviced the people pretty much of Westminster. A couple things, there's some urban legend, and this kind of will go forward from this, but a couple interesting things that I'd always heard, and I tried to verify today. One was that when Eisenhower was president, he was member of the Augusta, Georgia golf club where the Masters is played today, that he requested a cracker barrel be put in, and that Westminster crackers were his crackers of choice. Well, that was urban legend, but thanks to the computer and the internet, and you can go on, I found a letter from Eisenhower to a friend, Cliff, talking about the barrel that was made, that it was now at the country club. They don't usually do these things, but because he requested it, and although it doesn't mention the Westminster crackers in there, I know from seeing old ledgers and the history, the archives of Westminster, that we shipped crackers way back in the day to the Augusta National. They also went on many of Macmillan's trip to the Arctic because it was a good dry staple that would last for years and years, really, if you didn't expose it to moisture. So those are a couple of the urban legends that, if you have heard them, they probably are true to some degree. When the bakery moved in 1845-ish to the new building, that is about the time that leavened crackers came into being. And nobody is sure which company, was it Westminster or G.H. Bent or Montpelier or Cross, who actually made the first leavened crackers. But obviously somebody did, and everybody else caught on, and that was the genesis of the leavened cracker. And for any of you who, people familiar here with what a common cracker is? Common cracker is a large, round, almost like a biscuit, much more tender than hardtack. And that was kind of, and became known as the common cracker because that was basically the cracker that all of these bakeries made. And again, now they had a staple that had a shelf life much longer than bread that you could put into a store that would last for a few days. The advent of the Cracker Barrel, and the story behind that is quite simple. That was one of the earliest forms of repurposing within the industry. Flour was delivered in barrels, and what do you do when the barrel is empty? Well, we got to use it for something else. We put the crackers in it, we ship it. How does the store sell it? Well, we'll leave it in the barrel, we'll fill up the barrel, we'll sell the crackers. And for those who are familiar with common crackers, they were always known as the XXX common cracker. And people thought that the X had something to do with the cracker. It didn't. The X's were on the outside of the barrel. Flour was graded by X's, and the more X's it had, the better the quality of flour. And so this was a fairly good quality flour. It was a 3X flour. And so once again, that just transferred over to the cracker, letting people know that this was a quality product made with one of the better qualities of flour. So a little history about the leavened cracker and the Cracker Barrel and that. I think that probably, as I said before, that the horse and wagon probably came into being when the bakery expanded, because that would be the first time that I can feel that they were probably making a product at enough volume so that they could go out and distribute maybe beyond the bounds of Westminster or the immediate area. And at that time, cracker bakeries throughout the Northeast and probably beyond were fairly ubiquitous, and basically there was one, as far as a horse and wagon could travel in a day, was their route. That's the area they would take care of, and so if that was 20 miles away, there'd be another cracker bakery, and so on and so forth. G.H. Bent was in Boston, there was Portland Crackers, there was the Cross Baking Company, there was Montpelier Biscuit, and if you look back, a lot of those names have been lost to history, but there were a lot of those bakeries. And what happened in the early 1800s, as transportation started to become more broadened, some people started to buy up these bakeries and consolidate them. And one of the first was the New York Biscuit Company, which bought up 6 bakeries and consolidated them. And then maybe in I think the best I could figure was in 1890, the late 1890s, early 1900s, the American Biscuit Company, a group got together and they bought up 40 bakeries, and they also bought up the New York Biscuit Company, and they became the American Biscuit Company. And then sometime shortly thereafter, they became known as the National Biscuit Company. And that was really the genesis of production going on a grander scale, not only for that, but a lot of things at that time. And we always said, you know, why didn't they buy Westminster? We'll never know. Here it was a good, solid business, standalone, ripe for the taking, but for whatever reason, that never transpired. And so by the 1840s, when they built the new building and got in production here, they were the largest independent producer of crackers in New England, and considered maybe in the whole country at that time, because this consolidation was going on all over the place. So they became a substantial player out of this little building down here in 1845. And through that time, pretty much the Dolly family was always in control of the bakery from a controlling standpoint. There were other partners. Frank Battles, back in the early late 1800s, was a partner of my great-great-grandfather he was bought out. Herm Shepherd came in, I think, in the 1930s or so, or even earlier, maybe 1918, let's see. Yeah, in 1918, he became a partner. He was there for a while. Then later on, Charles Dolly bought him out. And from about 1941 on, really the Dolly family controlled the Cracker Bakery and its works moving forward. Now, totally, as I said earlier, things happen at points in time that are totally unrelated, that have no significance at the point in time, but later come into the fold. So in the early, mid-1940s, 1946, Vrest and Mildred Orton opened the Vermont Country Store, which we all know today, which is still in Western Vermont, and also has a store in Rockingham. And for those who don't know it, that quaint little store today is now over $1 billion business, which operates their catalog sales out of right outside of Rutland, Vermont. The thing that brings some significance there is, I can't tell you the date, but shortly thereafter, Vrest decided that he'd like to have crackers to sell from his store. And so my uncle, who was now the third generation, he was the grandson of Charles Dolly and involved in the business. Vrest got a hold of him and said, geez, Porter, we'd like to have some common crackers to sell in our store. And so sometime, probably in the early 40s or thereabouts, soon after, they started producing the common cracker, and they packaged them under the Vermont Country Store label, and the Ortons continued to sell them as their product through the life of through the first life of the Westminster Cracker Company. Now, in 1952, as I read the history, it says new equipment was added down here, and I really don't know what equipment that would have been, because at that time they were baking in a real style brick oven where you were literally hand peeling the crackers into the oven, hand peeling out, sorting, weighing, packing by hand. So it was still a fairly rudimentary process. So I can't tell you what was added there, but in 1958, that's when the significant change came. And if you know the building, it's the nice, quaint little Westminster Cracker building on the front, but if you drive around the corner and out South Street, you'll see that there's I guess, as far as the building is concerned, what we call the new portion, which was built in 1958. And at that point, they got rid of the brick oven and they went to a new line of automated equipment that was manufactured by the Thomas L. Green Company out of Indianapolis, Indiana. And I bring up the Thomas L. Green Company again. They were a significant player in the baking industry, and to this day, although they've sold out, their equipment is still out there. And Tom Lugar, I believe at the time, was involved. I know he was. He was not yet president, because I think Thomas Green was still involved. The fellow who put in the line, the site engineer, George June and Frank Hubbard, and I only know this information. This isn't published anywhere, but I only know that from my Uncle Porter and Peter, who I was involved with growing up. And so a significant change. They went from producing probably 300 or 400 pounds an hour in a brick oven to producing roughly 1,000 pounds an hour in the new automated line. So it really brought them into the 20th century. And it was a big decision at the time. My uncle used to tell me that they were at a point in time, like most businesses come to, when you need to make a capital investment, should we make this much of a capital investment, and we either have to make it to keep up, or it's time to look to maybe sell the company and the brand name to somebody else. But that decision was made. And so from 1958 through 1968, the crackers were made right here in the center of town. What happened during that time was, in the 1940s, they started taking some of the crackers and grinding them into cracker meal. And they did the cracker meal for the restaurant trade. It was packaged in 25-pound sacks, and it was distributed throughout New England, although they weren't around at the time, but the Cisco-type U.S. food service houses that service restaurants today, those types of businesses handled this product to the restaurant trade, and they became the #1 selling cracker meal in New England. And it was used in the restaurant for stuffing and for the breading of fish, for the making stuffing for chicken or whatever the restaurant needed a cracker meal for. During that same time, or during the time, but a little bit later, this started in the 40s, and I hate to admit it, I'm probably old enough to remember this. The late 50s, the prepared home meal, the advent of the prepared meal for the home started to come into play. And one of the very first things that you could buy in the store, take home, heat up in the oven, was a fish stick.
Yeah.
And most of those fish sticks were produced right here in the Northeast. They were produced from Portland down to Gloucester, right up and down the seaboard. What they used at that time, and I can also remember this unfortunately, going with my parents, when you went to the store, you bought bread. And the next day if you went, there was fresh bread and there was day old. And anything more than day old went back. And now all that day old bread went back and was recycled into bread crumbs, which then went on to the fish industry to bread fish sticks, probably went to the restaurant trade and all that. So two things happened. It's supply and demand. The supply, the bread bakers found out a way to extend shelf life, and the fish industry kept selling more fish. And so before very long, they stripped out the supply and they demanded more and more breadcrumbs. Well, there really isn't a way to make breadcrumbs without making a loaf of bread. And so a lot of them converted and started using the Westminster cracker crumbs. They came up and they heard about this little company that was already making cracker crumbs. That's what we'll use. And so if you're a child, which I think most of us are, of the 50s and 60s, if you ate a piece of Mrs. Paul's fish, Gordon's of Gloucester, or Taste of Sea, it had a Westminster cracker crumb on it. They were the exclusive supplier to those manufacturers of fish. At the same time, all of those manufacturers were clamoring, we need a breadcrumb, and we know you can't make a loaf of bread economically enough. We need a breadcrumb as opposed to just cracker meal. And so my cousin Peter started playing around with the idea of how do we get a breadcrumb without making a loaf of bread first. And so as that happened, at the same time, in spite of not having a breadcrumb, the cracker meal demand overwhelmed the cracker business. And so in 1968, the end of the manufacturing of Westminster crackers became a reality. It was a choice. We've got to take this business in one way or the other, and so it was strictly a business decision. It wasn't that the cracker was failing, the cracker was successful, it was in demand, but we can only make so much, and the plant is maxed out, so we're going to stop making that. And they had already started in 1966 developing and engineering a new plant for the manufacturing of cracker meal, and hopefully something that came close to a bread crumb. And that plant was being built down on Barthrick Road, which is if you go down past the old mill here towards Fitchburg, just before you get to the underpass by the Depot Package Store. If you take a left, that's Barthrick Road, and it goes up and comes out along the railroad tracks there. And so they were building a plant down there, and they were continuing to run the plant here. At which time, the class of '70, which is in the back row, one of my first jobs, well, my very first job at Westminster Cracker was on the sanitation. Was in the sanitation department, which involved myself and Mr. Gus Wiley, who lived uptown. Gus was about 5'10", 380 pounds, and I marveled at him because he moved like a ballerina. He went through that shop. He took me with him, and what you did was you started in the back room and you swept all the way through this fine layer of cracker dust, and you picked it up And when you got all done, it was like painting the Golden Gate Bridge. You went back to the, and you swept through again. But every day, he showed up with a picnic basket. And I'll tell you, it's no wonder he was 300, and I, without any exaggeration, 350 pounds. I used to look at the food that he brought in and just say, boy, I never met Mrs. Wiley, but she's going to be a pretty good cook. And I had to do that because I wasn't old enough yet to work on equipment. But I think back then you only had to be 16, so very shortly after, two of my classmates, Dennis Lawrence and Paul Spano, and I, as Bambi is now shaking her head, in the summer became employees of the Westminster Cracker Company, and we had the privilege of bagging cracker meal in the old plant with some really great guys. And the one thing about the bakery is I can only say that although it wasn't our career, they must have been great employers because the people who were there had been there for years on end. Franny Harrington and, if you know, Eddie Turnpike Barrett, and these guys spent their whole career there. And they took us under the wing, and they knew it was we were short-termers, but it was a lot of fun working with the old guys and hearing the stories and understanding what went back in the day. So they finally got the plant down on Bathrick Road to the point where it was ready to run. To say the least, they had a lot of issues down there from an engineering standpoint. They went from a traditional cracker line baking very simply 1,000 pounds an hour to a plant that if you walked into, you would have thought, even now today, you're on the spaceship Enterprise. This thing looked like something out of a science fiction movie. And my cousin and a couple of other engineers got together, and the whole concept was, how do we make a breadcrumb without making the loaf of bread first? And it came down to this high extrusion process, cooked by steam. They got the whole thing together, and I wasn't there for the details. All I know is that the first time they ran it, that stuff bound up inside, and they were burning out 200 horsepower motors and breaking shiv wheels and belts. And Peter told me in the 100 and whatever many years, 140 some odd years history of the Westminster Cracker, it was the first year they'd ever had a financial loss. And again, you know, why do you survive? What happens that, you know, when something like that happens? And so sometimes it's the people that you would never connect to this business, but Henry Morse, the Morse is an old family name here in town. Henry was a good friend of Peter's, and Henry got down there and he kind of shook his head and said, you know, this is way beyond me. He says, you know what, I got to introduce you to the Jandresses up in Gardner. And Peter said, what, at the cement block place? He says, yeah. He says, you got to meet Adolph, and you got to meet Dizzy, the engineer, and that. And you know, these guys who had never made a cracker in their life, but boy, they knew how to engineer stuff. They knew how to fix stuff. And so, even though it seems totally disconnected, there's probably a very good chance, if it weren't for somebody in the cement block business up in Gardner with no experience in cracker manufacturing, that this company may have survived, but you never know. They brought a very unique set of ability and talent to the party at a time when it was really needed, and they got through their trials and tribulations, and the plant went on to produce. They never quite got to the point where they could make a breadcrumb, but they got pretty damn close. And to put it into perspective, where they were running 1,000 pounds an hour down here, that plant would run to 9,000 pounds an hour, and they were running that 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and just supplying the world with a pretty good product. And another product, the genesis of another product that we all probably are very familiar with, came out of there, and that is they developed and for years supplied a product that was the base for the Lipton cup of soup noodle. So anybody who ate some of the first Lipton cup of soups, that noodle product, the base product was manufactured down in Westminster. It went on to the Thomas J. Lipton Company down in New Jersey, and they added some water and extruded it again, and they turned it into so they basically developed the base for the first rehydrated noodle in the industry down there. So 68 through 82, I think things were flying along pretty famously down there. was an OEM company making millions of pounds a year, but, you know, margins, you know, tenths of a cent on the pound. I never worked in that plant, but I guess a little bit of the backstory of my involvement. And another one of those things is how stars align is, much to my mother and father's dismay, Peter's 14 years older than me. And having worked there in '69 and being divorced from his first marriage, he felt compelled that he would take his young cousin under his wing and expose him to parts of life, let's say the party side of things, the fun things that every 17-year-old dreamed about and every parent's worst nightmare. That's a whole nother speech I could give, because I'm sure that most of the stuff I would tell you that the statute of limitations has run out. But anyways, we laugh about it now, and it was what it was at the time, but it is part of this whole history thing, and the thing I'm making the point of is, if I don't work there, if Peter isn't my cousin, if he doesn't probably start drawing me in, having worked there and doing this in 1969 or 70, now we're going to fast forward to 1988 when we resurrect. I probably don't have that relationship with him, and maybe I'm not here giving this speech today. So it's one of those, it's one of the pieces of the puzzle that, you know, even though we have a little laugh about it, certainly fits and is part of the story. So 1981, 82, the company again was at a point in time, other people, obviously with their success, like anything else, other manufacturers, the Newlywed Company and the Japanese breadcrumb had come in, which we know as Panko today. The advent of all that stuff was coming to play, and they knew once again that if they were going to continue to compete, that as big as they were going to have to make another huge capital investment to keep this thing moving forward. And they did not go out and solicit the sale at the time or put it up for sale, but it just so happened coincidentally at the same time that they were going through this deliberation internally that a call came from the Pillsbury Company that they had interest in purchasing Westminster Cracker. And because of my relationship with Peter, although there was no professional relationship, during their negotiations and during this, it was the first time that I had an exposure through him, into how larger companies work and operate. And so it was pretty fascinating as these people came to town. He said, come on, we're going out and have a drink with Dick Newberg, who was the controller of the whole Pillsbury Company, who was a delightful guy. And so it gave you that window in. And so obviously they came to terms with Pillsbury. And one of the most remarkable parts of that story is they're sitting in 1982 at the law offices of Bingham, Dana & Gould down in Boston, and they're signing off on the final purchase and sale, and you know, they've got the lawyers. I'm not there, but I've heard the story, and everything's going on. Now it's an asset sale. They're not selling the corporation, they're selling the assets, and they're selling the brand name and all of that. So it's the intangibles, the tangibles of the assets, but not the corporation. And literally at the day of the closing, Porter's Sr.'s wife, Dolly, piped up and said, well, what about the crackers? And they said, well, we don't have any interest in the crackers. Nobody's made them for 14 years. You guys can have them if you want them. So literally, at the day of the closing, without retyping up anything, the lawyers took and they noted in the margins on the purchase and sale agreement, it was worded something to the effect of, if the Dolly family ever so desires to use the brand name again for the production of crackers, cookies, etc., they shall have the rights to use the Westminster brand name.
Wow.
1982, sign the documents, family walks away, divides up the money, Peter, his brother, his father, and with probably no idea or no intentions of ever, you know, doing anything with Westminster Cracker again. Sometime between, I think around 1984, Peter got involved with some folks. I guess in hindsight you may say bad, but not bad. They had a legitimate idea and a legitimate concept and a legitimate business that was going strongly, a company in Europe, and they were developing a new way to process textiles. You know, it wasn't necessarily the weaving of textiles. They could basically take any two textiles and they could seal them together with ultrasonic waves. And between those two pieces of fabric, they could put foam rubber or insulation, and so the applications looked like they were endless. And the company was already experiencing success in Europe. Well, the long and the short of that was Peter got involved with a group of investors here. I was one of them. I wasn't day to day, and that company struggled along for 3 years, and it was strictly a situation of technology that was probably ahead of its time for us here. The U.S. had a lot more constraints on what you could do in the medical business and this and that than they had in Europe. And so it was the typical company that probably had a lot of upside potential, but it was grossly undercapitalized for what they were going to try and do. Now, of course, APAR has nothing to do with crackers, other than if you run out of money trying to run APAR, then you got to figure out what you know how to do and what you can do. And so, after Peter kind of licked his wounds a little bit and decided maybe I should go back to the basics of what I know, and Roger being one of them, but many people, and myself being one, over the years we always said, geez, Westminster crackers were so good. Why doesn't somebody make them again? Well, we're not going to make crackers again. You know, that's ancient history. You know why? But there was a lot of people that had that feeling, and it was a great product. And so Peter had subsequently moved up to Vermont, was living in Vermont, and trying to figure out what his next move was. And so I was down here. I was working for myself. I was a carpenter. I was building houses and doing construction and remodeling and that type of stuff. And he called me up in 1st of October of 1987 and said, why don't you come up to Vermont for Columbus Day weekend? He said, I got something I want to talk to you about. I had absolutely no idea what he was talking about over the phone, and so sure, I'll come up, and I did.
I just want to throw Keith. Every time I see Peter in one of our social activities, you know, at the ice cream bar or something, I would say, Peter, why don't you make a Westminster cracker?
Yeah.
But
well,
we kept at him.
Well, we kept at him, and then you know, you don't want to starve to death. You have to go back to work. And I always said, you know, I think one of the things that inspired Peter and I to do this was nobody else would hire us. We had to work for ourselves. Anybody who knew the two of us, it wasn't like we had it wasn't like you had a resume that you were going to put out there and hope that somebody was. So we sat at the table up there on that Columbus Day weekend, and we talked about it. And I said, well, let me go back and think about this a little. And he said, yeah, all right. And so, you know, the housing, you know, for those who remember, 1987, we're coming into 1988, wasn't the best of economic times. I was single, didn't have a family. And I said, you know what, this sounds like a new adventure. So I packed my bags and I moved up to Vermont on April 1st of the following year. Now, this is where this little piece of the story is really where the timing for everything maybe has to be right. Because if you knew Peter, as a lot of you do, on the other side of that page, he's a brilliant guy with a great business acumen. And I always said, if you had to draw a line down the middle of the page, if they said define the statement, what's the difference between genius and insanity? I said Peter's name would be right there, and I'd say that in front of him. So. But he did, and he had that. And so when he got there, he said, you know, I really don't think that we should move forward with this, putting all our faith on what was penciled into a purchase and sale agreement 14 years ago in a law office in Boston. Now, I remember the names because when that closed, Dick Newberg was the controller of the Pillsbury Group. Ralph Thrain was the director of acquisitions, and Betsy Carter was their legal counsel, their in-house legal counsel on the sale in 1982. So in 1988, Peter picks up the phone to the Pillsbury Company and he says, any chance Ralph Thrain is still there? Yeah, Ralph's still here. Well, can I speak to him? Yeah. He gets on the phone. Well, Ralph was still there, Newberg was still there, Betsy Carter was still there, and what they did was what they should do, which was honor, and he said they were honorable people and he didn't expect it, but you know, probably the ace in the hole was that right at that time, Grand Met out of England was in the process of purchasing the Pillsbury Company. And I was sure that Ralph and Betsy and those people were probably sitting in Minneapolis up in the tower going, you know, when this goes through, I wonder what our future holds for us. And if we're going to do this for Peter, we better get it off the table before this transaction takes place. And it was probably one of the quickest reassignments from a company like that you could ever see. We got a full assignment back from the Pillsbury Group saying, basically, you now own the rights to the Westminster brand again. We have dissolved ourselves of all interest because their purchase and this is just reverting back. They purchased the place in 1982. They had dissolved the Westminster brand under their own umbrella by 1984. Typical big company purchasing a little teeny tiny company and not being able to get there. And those are fascinating stories there, but it really doesn't have to do with Westminster Cracker. So that brings us up to April of 1988. We've got an assignment back from the Pillsbury Company, and we've got an idea. And the only thing that neither one of us have between us is 1 red cent to put into it. So here we are, we're undercapitalized again. And so I think, as I said to Barry earlier, to go through this whole litany, because we just basically went through the first 160 years, but from 1988 to 2009, those 21 years is kind of the chapter 2 of the Westminster story, and to try and, I can speak for a lot more hours on chapter 2 than I can on chapter 1, so I think what we're going to do is say, if you're interested, I'd be delighted to come back sometime and tell you chapter 2. But for now, I'm going to close my little speech.
Oh, yeah.
And open the floor, if so be, or Barry. Any questions, if anybody has any?
Just tell them about where you get the machinery.
Yeah, but that's chapter 2, right?
Well, just tell them about the one in Hawaii you had to get
well, we bought a rough bucket of bolts in Kilo, Hawaii, and that's where names like Tom Lugar and George June from the Thomas L. Green Company come back for full circle 25 years later, 20 years, yeah, 25 years later. Those names, and the Roger Smith name comes back 25 years later.
Crackers need baking.
Yeah.
How have the crackers been baked over that 160 years? Coal, wood, electricity?
Can't say what was happening in the first little bakery on the side of the house, but that, I assume, was probably a wood-fired oven of some type. When they built the bakery next door, that was a big oven. That's what I think that was like what they call a 60-pan oven, which is, and it's a real type oven. It's a Ferris wheel with shelves that you peel directly onto, and an oven like that would probably produce easily, knowing what we started with, that would probably produce 600 pounds of crackers an hour, and that was coal-fired, at least at some point. Now, whether it was ever converted to whatever, I mean, literally, that oven, the walls of that oven were probably 7 or 8 courses of brick thick. And I know that from another experience, which was getting up in the bowels of and chipping bricks out of there at one time because Peter wanted to build some stuff out of the old oven bricks. that was a different story in a different life. And if you would like to, anyone would like to see that, I can make arrangements to take you up into the bowels of it. It's still there. Pieces of it are still there. So that was coal-fired. When they put the line in 1958, they had tremendous problems with that because they had been baking in the brick oven, and this was a whole new, which was a Ferris wheels type oven, and now what they're baking in 1958 is pretty much the same concept of what they're baking in today, which is what we would call a tunnel oven, or we call a band oven, which is just a straight line shot where the dough is extruded out, goes through the oven, when it comes out the other end, it's done. And that would be either propane or natural gas at this point. What they found out from a technical standpoint, when they first went from the brick oven to the new band oven down here, the crackers just were nowhere near what they should be. And they went through a lot of trials and tribulations getting that. And what they discovered was, technically, that when you're baking brick, red brick, not necessarily fire brick, but red brick, which was what was down here, when that oven is fired and it had a dome in the top of the oven, the heat in a brick oven emits back into the oven in forms of parabolas, and it's infrared heat. So it's like a huge microwave from the standpoint that it's baking from the inside out. And because that heat is coming back in parabolas, and you're passing that oven, and those shelves are going through a 360-degree cycle, and it's one time around. They go in, when they come out, they're done.
What was the temperature of the oven, like 300, 350?
Well, we started with a smaller version of that in Vermont. We were baking around, 450 degrees, somewhere around there. In the band oven, we're baking in the 550 to 600 degree range. Yeah. And the thing about baking crackers is, whether it be in a real oven or a band oven, they bake so many pounds per square foot, and it doesn't matter how heavy the cracker is. If it's a heavy cracker, you get less crackers out equaling the same number. If it's a thinner or lighter cracker, but the pounds per hour remains the same regardless of the thickness of the dough. And so on a band oven, the industry would say you're getting probably about 5 pounds per square foot per hour. We baked a little slower. We were probably getting about 4.5 pounds an hour up when we were baking in Vermont. What we found is that they still make it, but the guys today, the crackers that you buy for the most part are sheeted very thin. They're very uniform. They're very crispy. They're baked out. They don't puff, and they don't have a lot of flake. Our oyster cracker is pretty thick compared to what other crackers are. And so that causes us to bake slower, to bake that moisture out. It also required another piece of equipment called a post conditioner, which nobody uses anymore. And it also, even though the band oven would look the same from the outside, we had put brick inside of our ovens, and we used a material called maronite instead of steel on the inside. It's a man-made composite, but it was something that we found that simulated as close as we could to brick. We could never, it's like anything else in automation, especially in the baking industry, is each time you take a step forward in capacity, on a given line, you seem to lose a little bit. But we ended up in Vermont. When I left, we had one line. We were baking at roughly 1,400 pounds an hour. And we said right there, we're not going to bake any more than that on this line. And so when we sold the company in '09, part of our decision was, we were at that point where we were maxing out that line. You know, we were running 24 hours, 6 days a week. And you don't just go down to the kitchen store and buy another band oven. It's custom made. So our decision to sell in '09 was somewhat based on, you know, what the capitalization would be moving forward and how long that would take us to recapture that. And the fact that the management group was all getting a little long in the tooth, with no youngsters coming along to take over. So it just made sense. I would have done it till I was 80 years old. I absolutely had a wonderful time doing it. After the first 10 years, the second 10 years.
I would like to know a little more about Dolly. She sounded like she had some business sense. I always thought it was very funny when I moved here that her name was Dolly.
Well, it wasn't originally, but
so
she
how
had.
Did she get the Dolly
Well,
name?
it came from days of parties, and when she would enter the room, everybody's singing "Hello, Dolly," and so eventually she legally changed her name to Dolly.
Oh, she did. Okay.
I don't think so, because my mother was checking voters in,
Yeah.
and when she would come through, then
Yeah.
the person would have to yell across the hall, you know, so that it could be checked off. And my mother would yell, "Frances Dolly." Frances, it wasn't English. But she was a beautiful, tiny, sweet little woman. So
I
she
remember
was a Dolly.
her in her later years,
Yeah,
but
she was
not.
adorable.
Yeah. And she was part of the business, or she was.
Yeah, she was the quasi-treasurer. She had a title. Yeah. Of course, you never saw her at the Fireman's Ball in full turnout gear at 2 o'clock in the morning on the back of a fire truck after she'd had a few. So she was a lot of fun too in some respects. Yeah, she missed that part. Yeah. In a lovely white dress covered in soot.
One thing a lot of folks don't know, that her first name, Dolly, was D-O-L-L-Y.
Yeah.
Not the same as her last name.
Oh, yeah.
Recently,
Oh,
a few months ago, someone died in town, I guess that knew Dolly, and there was a misprint in the paper because they named her Dolly, D-A-W-L-E-Y.
I have a story. My name is Betsy Hanula. I'm the curator here, and when the school committee used the building, they rented the building, the cracker factory, right? And I don't know, I guess I went there to visit or something, and I went downstairs. And I saw in the basement that all the school records were covered with green mold.
Oh.
And I know the rules, and the rules are that state documents like that have to be preserved. Yeah. They cannot be moldy. They had no idea that there was a river underneath South Street and the cracker factory, which powered the huge water wheel that ran the power. I mean, it's amazing to know, and most people here probably aren't even aware. Is the belt that was run by the water wheel still there?
Well, when I worked there in '69, you know, we weren't baking crackers at that point. We were baking the cracker meal off of the cracker line, and what would have been the upstairs over the superintendent's office, we had a conveyor go up there, and there was a Fitz mill up there that did the grinding, and that ran off of some pretty old belts, but you know, through a electric motor. Now,
right.
Whether those were they were pretty, even for 1969, they were pretty archaic. Yeah.
But I wonder when that transition was made. I mean, I don't think electricity didn't come out to where we lived in South Westminster until the 40s. So you had mentioned that there was some outlay of capital to improve the building, and I'm just curious when there was power in the center of town and when they would have switched from water power to some other kind of power, electrical power.
Yeah.
So what were the processes that you would have needed power for? Because in our collections we have, the cracker press, which we did by hand, but you must have had a machine that like cut out lots of crackers at one time at one point, right?
Yeah, I think when we restarted the company, the cracker cutting machine from 1900, the frame of it was still in the building at that point. So there was something between 1845 and that. But I would say that the only thing that would require power in like the 1840 area would be some type of a cutting machine and something to power the rotating oven.
Oh, the
Outside of
rotating
that,
oven, right.
I wouldn't think there would be power needed for anything else.
Wow. And when did you say that the dome oven that you used to peel to put the crackers in, when did that get out of use?
The peeling of crackers?
I assume you meant putting crackers, unbaked crackers on a wooden peel, and putting them in the oven and pulling them out when they're done.
Yeah, I'm assuming 1958 because that's when the Thomas L. Green Company came in, and there wasn't anything between the oven and between the brick oven and that.
Wow.
And then when we started, again that would be part of chapter 2. But when we restarted in 1990 in Rutland, Vermont, we went back to the turn of the last century. We were hand peeling on wooden peels.
Oh my gosh.
Into the oven.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Pretty much, with the exception of electricity, we were pretty much back in the dark ages as far as cracker manufacturing is concerned. Yeah.
What's the building being used for now?
Just gonna ask.
I know the school community.
Well, Joe, yeah, that's been out of there for a long time. Joe Porter sold that long before, probably back in early 90s. He told it to a fellow, Joe McNeil, who still owns it. And the front has never really been used for anything other than I know recently Joe lived there. Well, he's having a new house built, but his business is in the backside, and he has out by where the town barn used to be. He has a metal polishing business where he does high-end finishing of metals and that kind of stuff. But a lot of it's just storage and that. Yeah.
It's too bad you couldn't find some way to get that original building in usage for the public, rather than just driving by and admiring it. It'd be great if it
well, I know.
Maybe going back into the food industry, whether it's a coffee and sandwich place.
Yeah, I don't know. The zoning wouldn't let manufacturing there, but I've always thought, if you bought the property, you could certainly tear down, the back end for parking.
Exactly.
And the front end would make a couple, like a lawyer's office or a dentist's office or something like that. And I know that Joe McNeil would be happy to sell it to anyone who has the money who would like to do that right now.
Yeah, of course, offices, but again, a public usage.
Yeah.
Are the museum artifacts still in there?
No.
So did those go up to Vermont? I mean, there were lots of things hanging on the walls, as I recall.
What's that?
There were lots of artifacts hanging on the walls.
Yeah, a lot of the artifacts weren't even necessarily cracker making stuff. I mean, they kind of had all the antique saws and stuff. They may have had some. See, way back, if you pulled in the driveway between the house and the bakery, part of the old building was straight ahead, which eventually became the garage, to park cars in. But way back in the day, they had a blacksmith in there and maybe a cooperage. They did all their own work. So they were somewhat vertically integrated. And back where they store the school records underneath, that's where they used to store all the flour. They hand loaded it down in through that. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
It was pretty.
In the early 20s, there were gas pumps up front.
That's right.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
really?
We see.
Right near this, or South Street side, is a single gas pump.
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting for the
Where'd the
delivery
flour come
trucks.
from? Yeah. Or was the flour local?
No, I imagine most of it came from the Midwest. Maybe in the early days there was enough. But when I was in the business, the closest we ever bought from was we bought a little out of upstate New York, but most of everything came from. We eventually, for the most part of my time there, we dealt with one mill, but they purchased all over the country to blend what we needed for our needs.
What happened to the building on Balthrick Street?
Well, Fitchburg City Metal went in there, and I don't know who's in there now.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah,
It's
you know,
still there?
it's still there as far as I know.
Yeah,
Somebody,
the
yeah, I mean, it was a pretty nice building with railroad siding and that, yeah.
But the old building, I agree, is really iconic for Main Street in town, and with those of us who travel a lot, we went and visited our son in West Palm Beach last year, all excited to be served Westminster oyster crackers. We were talking to the waitress about it like she cared, you know. She was like 20 years old, she was like, oh, okay, that's nice. You go around town, you go around the country, you see these things.
Just give me a good tip and shut up.
Well, exactly. Like, I'll pretend I'm interested.
Well, we got, I mean, one thing, I mean, what Barry's saying is remarkable, because whether you knew Westminster crackers or not, one thing that always just astounded us was, and of course, we started this before there was, I mean, there was no such thing as email. I mean, I can remember us even,
Facebook.
we were discussing whether we should even buy a fax. 1988, right? But immediately, you know, we started in 91, we started, and very soon after we started getting, of course, the easiest way was for them to write a handwritten letter with a stamp, and we kept the volumes, and I think when I left, we had well over 6,000 or 7,000, and of course, at that point, we were getting emails, but I mean, for the first 10 years, it was either a fax or a handwritten letter expounding, and people would draw pictures. But a funny story is one of the very first ones we got was from a young couple who was honeymooning on Cape Cod, and they wrote back and they said, the highlight of our honeymoon was going around finding who served Westminster crackers. Wait a minute, where does this man True story.
Well, we look forward to your second chapter. I think what makes history so much fun, though, is personal stories. So
Yeah.
it's, We're staying in the room only, but there's refreshments, coffee, cider to drink. So thank you for coming, everybody.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, this is great. All right.